What I'm going to talk about is Gurdjieff, the dark night of the soul, and what the deeper nature of the ego is. When I began meditating, it was inspired largely out of Krishnamurti, almost entirely. And I find there's a great deal of similarities between Krishnamurti and Gurdjieff. And so I'm going to describe my meditations, and I think you can see a lot of Gurdjieff in it. And then I'll go on and talk about what happens in the dark night of the soul and how they might be tied in together, and what it reveals about a deeper nature of the ego than it has been described in the past. Because my meditations, I usually used to go outside into nature, and I would sit and look out at nature, and I would watch my thoughts and my feelings. And to describe it basically, often when you sit and watch your feelings, your thoughts and so forth, what it's occupied with can be rather trivial. And this might even discourage people to think it's kind of meaningless to observe your thoughts in this sense. And however, the act of watching them is quite meaningful. And if you don't notice anything while you're meditating, probably when you get up and leave, you might notice a difference, that you actually became more quiet than you might have realized, and see more clearly, perhaps in the contrast with the state you were in while you're meditating. So often these trivial thoughts would dissipate and stop just because the act of watching them, listening to them, waking up to them in a sense, stills them, just ends them, because they're so trivial. But usually below that, there is something, often something that's bothering you, or that's causing these thoughts to move. And of course, that's basically because of desire, either trying to avoid something or to move towards something pleasurable. And often you're trying to resolve a problem or something, and this can often go largely unnoticed. It would with me. And however, I would look for any sense of avoiding something. This would end because of the nature of your observations. I would sit partly out of just an interest in seeing all of this. And of course, the act of meditating makes you more close to, intimate into your own thoughts and feelings, sense of being, and which is something beautiful, of course. And just the very sense of looking at it without any motive, just interested in the whole thing, interested in the fact of all this, that you are avoiding certain thoughts and that there are things below that you are not facing. And so, because the only reason these thoughts are moving is because you're resisting looking at it, and the very act of looking at it then eliminates it, they would drop away as well. And then my mind would become much more subtle, much more quiet. And then I would look out at nature. I was often a give and take between looking at myself and looking out at nature. And with that sensitivity, I guess, or you just come into a deeper place once you're no longer, your thoughts are not moving so strong. And of course, now you have to be as aware of your feelings as your thoughts, and because they're together, and the feelings are why they're moving. your response to that. So, and then when I would do that, I could be aware of something, something transcendent, something standing behind nature is the way I would see it sometimes in nature, and something sacred, something of enormous meaning. And I had that when I was young. In childhood, I would, throughout my early teens, and well, throughout my teens, not very often, it would just break in. And so I was already aware that this great truth, you might say, was that all of our thoughts and feelings weren't reflecting that, but nonetheless we were from that. And so it gave me a knowledge that I could face anything. And that might have helped a lot in these meditations and allowed me to face any feeling I had, any thought, and of course, which is very humbling and so forth. So it's not easy to face some of these things, but a lot of it was just pure interest as well in the beauty of it all. And so anyhow, that pretty much characterizes meditation. And so then let me go straight into, and I think you could see similarities between that and Gurdjieff, and but then let me talk about the nature of the dark night of the soul. The dark night of the soul, you see, often psychologists will talk about it maybe exclusively as if it's a form of suffering and psychological in nature, they would inevitably think of it. But if you look at St. John of the Cross, it's very clear what he says about it. The dark night of the soul is the loss of God. Your awareness of it, not the loss of God, of course, but your awareness of it, your contact with it, your experience of that. And that's the cause of the suffering. Anyone who is suffering, from some other, event or something like that happened in life, would feel as though God were missing. They could easily, probably very likely. But that wouldn't necessarily be the dark night. Now, for a lot of people, I think it does tend to occur with some sort of traumatic exterior event. And it wasn't that way for me. And it essentially isn't that, though they can happen, of course, often perhaps at the same time. So what the dark night of the soul is the loss of all that contact with God, those experiences of that transcendent with all of its meaning. And I can't go into that. And so that in itself, of course, is a form of suffering. You're going to realize you lost what was most meaningful in life. Now, let me say two things about the meditation. And it's interesting reading Thomas Keating's Open Heart, Open Mind, and the centering prayer, because they don't look closely at the thoughts and feelings. And he seems to be trying to direct them straight into contemplation, which is really interesting. It wasn't what I did, so I can't say too much about it, how effective that was, and quite how things would develop, because I know Bernadette Roberts. See, I've known Bernadette Roberts. I knew her for nearly 30 years, because I went there with Joe Conti, who I think you are familiar with. A long time ago, we went to see her, and probably I went over 24 retreats with her over a period of nearly 30 years. And she never watched her thoughts and feelings. And her prayer was always directed straight at God. But I'm not sure, I don't think even I could have, if you told me to look at God, I don't know what I would have looked at. of course, they're not, Thomas Keating realizes this, just the very intention is good enough. So anyhow, it definitely can happen to people, the dark night of the soul. But if you look at Thomas Keating, of course, he's saying that there's the unloading of the unconscious, right? So eventually all the psychological stuff is going to go up. So I think meet it as you can, this suffering, and the whole psychological content. Now, what St. John of the Cross would say about the dark night of the soul is that it's a transformation. And this is key. What transforms? And what is lost? Why is it you lose that contact with God? And of course, he says you lose it to find it in a more subtle way. And that is absolutely true. And you're going to find it in a more passive way. That's what they talk about, passive contemplation and active contemplation. Clearly what Ouspensky and Maurice Nicole are talking about is active contemplation. And I realize he's talking about a fourth way, and something else comes in. That something else that seems to come in with him is really this simple awareness that in itself has no motive. And I don't know if I'm characterizing that well enough, but that's I think, and which is something extraordinary, because when you actually look at yourself like that, well, the first time you do it, once you really realize what's taking place, you're seeing so much that otherwise would have gone unnoticed. So much of your life, so much of your life is what's happening interiorly. And to never really look at that is quite a loss. Like some philosopher said, an unexamined life is not worth knowing. I wouldn't want to go that far. But I felt like I was living 5 times as fast, not fast, but 5 times as rich as I was before, because I was aware of all of this. It's the difference, like I used to think of like going on a train, taking a journey on train, whether if sleeping through it or looking out the window and seeing all the scenery going by. Meditating is this great encounter with your own life, and which of course is the same as everyone else's. When you start meditating, I never was interested in the particulars of what I was thinking and feeling. I was only interested in the fact of it, because I knew that transcendent was beyond it. And I felt, and because Krishnamurti pointed it out, and he was my big influence in my late teens and early 20s, when I would do, and mid-20s, maybe even late 20s a little, when I would do this form of meditation. And he was the first and only person I read. I dismissed everyone else because he did. And it was only this thought he put forward, and it was clear in experience that was the only thing that really makes it hard to see the divine. And so, and it would work that way. If you face everything, it would fall away, and fall away along with your images of yourself. I'm going to describe it a little bit more completely, because to see what actually transforms, it helps to see this meditation in a little bit more fully what happens. So there would be thoughts, perhaps disturbing thoughts. I don't know if they're ever disturbing, but they're moving. And so the reason they'd move, is because there was something I'd be resisting. And so I would, Thomas Keating says, don't look in the hold of the boat. And I'm not sure that's exactly a description, because I wasn't interested in psychoanalyzing, so I wasn't going to think about it. I was just going to, I just wanted to see it completely. And the way to see something really deeply and completely is to just see the surface completely. By totally opening up to what's on the surface, then what's below it always reveals itself. At least so it would in my meditations like that. And what would often reveal itself is the following. Well, besides the particulars of the thoughts and feelings, is that I would have an image of the object. I would have an image of my intention. See, because we have a thought, an image, an intention to observe it. And my intention was that simple. It wasn't psychological. I wasn't trying to make myself better psychologically. It wasn't aiming for happiness. It wasn't aiming for peace. I was aiming for that transcendent. And I was looking at this also because it wasn't like I was just resisting these thoughts and feelings for the sake of coming upon the transcendent. But I really felt that all of creation, including thought and feeling, was coming from God. How can you love God and hate his creation? Say, oh, he doesn't know what he's doing, making suffering. Let's ignore that side. You see, that never even occurred to me. It was clear from the beginning that you can't find the beauty, the depth, with sensitivity if you're avoiding the suffering. It's just that is a psychological truth too, and knowing that does help. It does help having some psychological insights, and but of course, primarily it was because that transcendent was just so meaningful, so extraordinary. And to know that with our lives are so petty, and, our thoughts and feelings, and yet there's that transcendent. And this is what it's saying. What in the world is that? That could be saying this. Because the creation is what God is saying. If you don't look at the creation, you're missing part of it anyhow. And, so anyhow, so I wasn't looking to shoo away thoughts and feelings. I wanted to open up to the whole thing. And so there would be the object, all of my opinions about it, my thoughts and reactions, all the feelings it would evoke, and my intention toward it. And not just when you're meditating, but all the time. You always have some intention. You have his personality developed. You behave a certain way in the world. And so you do have these set of thoughts. And this is actually important to understand the transition. We have a certain view of ourselves and the world. And our will is functioning through that. And it takes those on. I like to call them intentions. Behave in a certain way. You're nice to people, they're nice back. All these things. And so I would see the thought, some situation, myself being in it, the image of myself, what I wanted out of the situation, all the thoughts and feelings involved, and these intentions, the will in its movement. And so it was, to me, often it was only when that whole thing was seen together at once that the whole thing would fall away. And then where is that self? That was living through these intentions, living through this, like he would say, you identify with something. And so you would identify yourself with something. You're also identifying the world, what it is. And you have these intentions toward it and all these feelings moving your will. And so they would all fall away. Because when they're all seen together and there is no motive, you see the motives completely. It's moving because you don't want to face something, don't want to see it. The very act of seeing it without any motive, without resisting anything. And of course, the resistance is gone. And you see it. And so it all still. And then my mind would be very silent. I'd sometimes sit in front of this lake at night, and I could see the lights reflected on it. And my mind, I knew, was just like that lake. Just clear and silent. And there would be thoughts and feelings occasionally. They'd be like those bright lights. And they'd go, come and go. And then there was something that transcended, was so close. Like Bernadette Roberts once put it, nature is such a thin veil over, it's just a thin veil over the divine. So anyhow, but so I had those experiences, but I must say, when I see someone whose life has been centered around the divine and hasn't had extraordinary experiences, you can see that what's happening is that their whole being is responding to the deepest point within them and to that communication from God, which is faith. Somehow they know, and they probably don't know how they know. And because the communication is as deep as God and as deep as yourself, self, as you're running with God. And so they're both in mystery. So if you ask yourself why you're meditating, why you believe in God, if you look for a reason, you will inevitably be pointed in the wrong superficial way. Don't even ask the question, or if you do, throw out every reason you get, because that faith, you can't see it really too well. I like to think that I pursued this out of faith, and not simply because I saw it, because that is so much more the extraordinary path. If you've been shown these things, that there is this transcendent, and that is truth, and you can then facing everything else becomes so much easier. So people who do it without that, just by being guided by that almost silent, the outward mind just can't see it. And to be in harmony with that is something extraordinary. So anyhow, okay, now the dark night of the soul is going to be a transformation, and the transformation you would never expect. Because now what you have to realize, keep in mind with the dark night of the soul, is that you're going to lose your contact with God. You're going to lose something good. Something you would, in the beginning, see no reason whatsoever for losing that. Why would you? And when you're meditating, and your meditations have reached this certain level, doesn't have to go too far, when you realize something beautiful is happening when you're meditating, you're getting in touch with yourself in a way. You're not just thought and feeling, but the very sense of intimacy and the depth of yourself, this sense of meaning, and this you call it being, perhaps. I like the word these days, intimacy. And so you're going to lose that. and this is what's going to happen. First of all, like I said, if you're aware of the thoughts and feelings, there's actually a completely different capacity in the mind that is able to open the whole thing up, see the whole thing. Somehow you look at it, and like I said, you look at the surface and the whole depth of it, the whole, your motive, your opinions, your intentions toward it, your all of that that's actually a separate movement from looking at the thought itself. I know that because it went down separately. It went down first. So that what happened in my meditations, and I never read anything of the sort, never read anything about the dark night of the soul or anything like that till much, much later. And I could sit and see the trivial thoughts, and it would never open up again, never open up into the divine. And I was at a loss for that. Of course, now there had been a period which might equate to the dark night of the senses, really an absolutely terrible phase, something so awful that for a decade or two I couldn't even recommend any of it, or the idea that someone would have to go through that. It would, like Bernadette Roberts said in her Dark Night, that she was on the border, felt she might go insane. And I knew I wouldn't go insane, but you knew you were right on the border of it. I had complete confidence that I wouldn't, but you were right on the border. And I think this corresponds with the initial, well, not the very initial, but when the Kundalini first starts going all the way up into your consciousness, and an absolutely uncontrolled energy at that point. So anyhow, and it's associated with the depth of the will. The will's going to transform. See, this is a capacity of the will, and to open up your thoughts. And then I lost the ability even to see the surface. Now I can't look at myself at all. And that's the whole looking at yourself, the separation, so that you can look at yourself, which Maurice Nicole makes so clear. I thought it was so interesting to read that. And that you can't change yourself if you are one. And that's absolutely true. This ability to change yourself is actually a capacity, and why the entire ego, one of the main reasons the ego was created, is this ability to separate off and to civilize yourself, to control yourself. I'll just put it under that umbrella, civilize yourself. Edit your thoughts and feelings, not strike out when you're angry. That's what the ego's for. That's what this capacity is for, to turn towards yourself and to modify yourself. But that, of course, is a division, as he points out quite clearly. And what this is, and the way I like to put it, is that as God unites with you, he's going to unite you within yourself. You cannot remain divided against yourself and be unified with God. And so your will, John of the Cross makes it very clear, your will is going to be united with God. In the depths of it, he's not going to control you like a puppet. And so your will, what it is that when you observe yourself, like he says, it's separation. So how is this actually taking place? You have these conscious thoughts to control these others. And so the will is moving through this very conscious layer. And you form these intentions to, see various things. Your will is going to control what you're going to look at. And you have all these opinions. Anyhow, so you have this collection of thoughts of yourself and the situations. But your intentions toward that, you see, is where the will is. The will is united with these thoughts to form these intentions. And that bond is quasi-permanent. That is what allows for the separation that he talks about, and which, of course, is taking place when you're meditating. When you're looking at your thoughts and feelings, you can't look at them. Once that capacity of will to bind with that, and then your will is a single movement from the subconscious all the way out. There's no self-editing, which would be dangerous in the beginning. That's why you civilize yourself first. And there is something a little bit dangerous. I used to go into a church and when my will was first united and ask God, is that really what you want? Even as a phase, I thought, there is a little danger here. But anyhow, that's an actual capacity. And when you're so I call that previous structure egoic consciousness, because it's not this trivial ego that people think of, that you're identified with something and you have you're a doctor, a lawyer, you're a nice person, you're this, you're that, all those images you have of yourself, you identify with all these things. And that, of course, is important, because when that identity stops and you see it in meditation, you sink into something deeper. So seeing that is not trivial. It's one of the important parts of your meditation, to see you're not just that. You are deeper than that. These are your identifications are just circumstantial and trivial and based on these desires that you happen to have. And and this flows so easily. This because the will is really bound, not bound. Someone put it bonded. I like that term better. Who came up with that? The guy who wrote Kundalini and Christian Spirituality. I got that term from him, and it was a good one. But he unfortunately didn't pull the whole thing together as to what the ego is. The ego actually is this capacity. The binding of the will is not something you have created. The very fact that the will can bind with thoughts this way is something extraordinary. And there's one other extraordinary part that I'm going to point out, and that is, well, I have to use the Hindu term prana. During a latter part of the transformation, when the cloud came down over me, like Bernadette had a cloud, the same experience, a cloud coming down, and I felt like I could barely see. And basically because of that, there were times afterwards where this prana would pull out of the brain. And intellectually, I don't like this description, but experientially, this is the way it feels, that this cloud, this prana, contains your very sense of intimacy in life. And that's what they call prana life. I think that's what the word means. When your prana pulls out of thought and feeling, out of the entire nervous system. Kundalini, as they say, is at the core of your spine, and you feel it coming up as an external energy. And one of the Hindus, I've read so little, but someone said the movement of the prana is more real associated with enlightenment. And I would agree with that. The real transformation, the Kundalini is first, and then the prana. Then when it pulls, where's the prana? Well, I've never seen anyone say where it is, but it's in the entire psychonervous system. All of the nerves, the body, it's in the brain. And when it pulls out, it kind of floats in that general area, which is why the chakras open up. And it's experienced there. Something very funny happens later. It's because it's happened recently with me. So, is that it ends up everywhere. All of everything you see is experienced with that same intimacy that you would want to find within yourself. So it's, but anyhow, the ability for prana to enter into the nervous system, into the brain, and bond with it, so that you feel you are living out of thought and feeling. Feeling is the most intimate experience, right? Generally, that's, if you talk, someone reveals that, their feelings, a very intimate thing that's going on here, it's felt very intimate. That somewhat changes, because this prana is going to pull out of the nervous system, kind of float in the general area. It can leave the body, and the consciousness slightly collapses. And, then feeling and thought is no longer your most intimate experience. That's what the Hindus are saying when they say, I am not my thought and my feeling. It is not that they don't intellectually identify it, as I say intellectual, you're going to think it's just an idea. No, you see it that way, that you see yourself as being this person or that, and so it's an idea, but it's a little more, because you kind of enter into it, take it on. I think Maurice said, or I forget the term he used, and Uh, so anyhow, uh, once that prana pulls out, you know that intimacy no longer resides there. Then you really say, I am not my thought and my feeling, because it is no longer your most intimate point. You come into something uh, deeper, and your intimacy resides there. And then what intimacy you have is in everything, and a real oneness, a kind of a certain beauty, and being, a different type of sense of being altogether. When the whole world is this one being, your being, and really one being. It's a beautiful thing, and um, so this ability of prana to enter thought and feeling is not man's creation. We do not have an ego because we have made an error in identifying. That's relatively superficial. From the very ability for will to bind with thought, for the prana to be bound into the psychonervous system, the ability for it to bind in and then pull out, that is an extraordinary creation of this prana and the will. It's and then of course the will comes down to its still point, in which it just stays there as this enormous energy that won't move. And it can go up to the heart, I find, but it's just a still point. And but just full of energy, enormous energy. And don't know if that's useful. But anyhow, okay, so the ego, you have to think of it as egoic consciousness, and no one's ever described it this way before, and it's so much deeper than just identification. And the implications, what implications are there for this? There's a lot. Let's see if I can think of it. Well, the spirit of meditation, when you're doing it without motive, you see, the will isn't acting on thought and feeling. That might be like almost, you see, it's in keeping with the later transformation. It might be what helps to have it take place. Bernadette Roberts once in one of her talks, she said about the dark night of the soul and this transformation of consciousness where you become one with God. She said, is this something you do or something God does? And I spoke up and said, well, I don't see why God couldn't have made it from the very beginning, that under certain circumstances, certain things would happen. And she didn't like that. She didn't want to get into all that, for crying out loud. So she immediately changed the subject. And no one seemed to notice that she dropped that immediately. But I can't help but wonder, because I think this preliminary meditation, see, it's in the same spirit. There's compassion there. I didn't mention that word. But when you're looking at these things with no motive, see, that's the will's act of love. Love without any feeling, any motive. The heart has its own way of love, of course. But this is the will's love and compassion. So all of this is in keeping with the transformation. And it absolutely must have something to do with the later transformation. Even though the later transformation, you're going to think when you're meditating and you're in this extraordinary state, because once your mind is clear and perceptive, then you see people more clearly. You have the space to have compassion for them. You don't just approach them with your own motives, your own self-interest. But so this meditative state is beautiful. The ego is something extraordinary and beautiful and good, because that's the deeper ego, is this very capacity for will to bind with thoughts and choose the best, choose what's right. and modify your own animalistic aspects, you know, and or most of them are human aspects, and that's why the ego was created. And the fact that prana combined in there gives you an entire dimension, a totally different dimension of experience. Because when thought and feeling and your perceptions are so intimate, you're living out of them. That's a unique dimension of consciousness. When consciousness transforms under the dark night, you are going to lose that. You lose something extraordinary and come upon something else extraordinary. So, so anyhow, that's what the deeper ego is. It's the binding of will with thought, the capacity for that. It's the immersion of all of uh, the brain and the nervous system in with this prana, so that you feel that it's so intimate and of course so important to you. And then the transformation undoes both of those. You are at that point, after that transformation, you cannot do what's being suggested in these by Gurdjieff and these people following them. You cannot watch yourself, period. Absolutely not. Now, what happens instead is that, of course, your thoughts and feelings are part of consciousness. Consciousness comes up as a single movement. You are aware of it, naturally, but you cannot watch it because you're not going to be able to bind with one part and look at another. Although, when you really see what's happening, you're not even looking. But it feels and seems exactly like that. So I don't want to go into that detail. But I don't want to. You'll think I'm. But anyhow, so that's the points I wanted to make. You should be aware. I was totally unaware of this transformation until almost completed, and you need to be aware that these beautiful things that you have will be lost in the dark night, and it will all be okay. All right, okay, that's what I wanted to say.